Have you ever met someone who calls a country home even though he was never born there? What if I told you a Jewish orphan born in the shadows of war, raised thousands of miles away from Manila, would one day look the world straight in the eye and say, "I owe everything I am to the Filipino people"? You might raise an eyebrow. You might wonder, how can a child of Israel, shaped by the pain of the Holocaust and the loss of everything he knew, end up speaking with warmth, almost reverence about a land so far from Jerusalem? But then you hear him speak, his voice soft, his eyes steady. He begins to hum an old kundan his Filipino caretaker once sang to him before bed. His Hebrew name is David, but ask him where his soul was nurtured, and he'll tell you without hesitation. The Philippines. The first time David set foot in Manila, he was years old. It wasn't by choice. It wasn't part of a holiday or grand adventure. It was exile, a routing of fate. He came not with luggage, but with trauma, packed into the small, nervous frame of a child who had already seen too much of the world. What happened before that day was unspeakable. His parents, German Jews, had disappeared during the final raids of World War II. David had been hidden by resistance fighters, shuffled between barns and attics like a secret too precious to risk being discovered. By the time the war ended, he was one of thousands of nameless orphans left to drift in the rubble of post-war Europe. A kind older woman, herself a volunteer nurse during the war, arranged his papers. She had heard whispers about a country far away, a Catholic country, strange and warm, one of the few in Asia that had offered refuge to Jews even before the Holocaust had ended. That place was the Philippines. President Manuel Elzison had already opened his doors to Jewish refugees when most of the world remained silent. And now, in the late S, even as the country was rebuilding from its own devastation, it still welcomed more, not as burdens, but as guests. That's how David ended up stepping off a ship in the port of Manila, clutching the hand of a volunteer he barely knew, staring out at a coastline thick with palms and unfamiliar smells. He didn't understand the language. He couldn't read the signs. He didn't know what Cana meant, or why strangers kept smiling at him with such soft, worried eyes. But he remembers one thing vividly: a woman in a simple dress, a little older than his mother would have been. She reached out to him, not with grand gestures, but with a bowl of arroz caldo, warm and fragrant. She didn't speak German, but she placed her hand gently on his head and said, "Anak, you are safe now." Anak. He would never forget that word. It didn't make sense to him then, but it felt real, more real than anything else he had heard in years. And in that small moment, sitting cross-legged on a bamboo mat, David began the slow process of becoming not just healed, but Filipino. His foster family lived in the outskirts of Quezon City. They weren't wealthy. The father drove a jeep. The mother sold fish at the palenque, but they took David in as if he were blood. His name was too hard to pronounce at first, so the neighborhood kids started calling him Batoy. It stuck. Even now, decades later, when he visits the old barangay, the elders still greet him that way. Bitoy, the little Jewish boy who once beat everyone in Luksong Tinik and ate with his hands like he was born to it. But it wasn't just about games and food. Something deeper began to grow in him, a kind of warmth he had never known in war-torn Europe. There was music at night. His foster father played the guitar by ear, plucking out Kundiman songs while the neighbors sang along. There were prayers before meals, not in Hebrew, but in whispered Tagalog, thanking God for even the simplest meal. And there was an unspoken rule in the house: no one eats until everyone is served, especially the child. For David, that sense of community was disorienting at first. In Europe, survival had meant silence, selfishness, even betrayal. But here, even the poorest family made space at the table. Even the stranger was called kapwa. He would later tell journalists in crisp Tagalog that startled them, "I lost my people in Europe, but I found my soul in the Philippines." As he grew, so did his love for the culture. He joined school plays, learned to dance tinikling, and memorized Filipino poems he didn't yet fully understand. His Tagalog was not perfect, but it was earnest, fluent enough to scold his playmates, and sweet enough to charm his titos. Yet behind the laughter, there were still nights of silence, dreams of train whistles and gunshots, the ghosts of a life lost in Germany, the ache of not knowing what happened to his real parents. One night when he was years old, he asked his Filipino nanay a question he had been holding in for years. "Do you think my mother would have liked it here?" She looked at him for a long time. Then she wiped her hands on her apron, knelt down and whispered, "Anak, your mother would have loved this land," because it gave her son back his smile. That was the moment David began to understand what home really meant. Not a birthplace, not a passport, but a place where your sorrow is welcomed and slowly, lovingly transformed. And that was only the beginning. David didn't arrive in the Philippines expecting to stay. In truth, he hadn't expected anything at all. At years old, expectations were a luxury. He had no dreams left to dream, no future he could picture, just survival. He had grown used to being invisible, to being the child tucked away behind curtains and in cellars who didn't cry even when he was hungry. So when people in the barangay began to notice him, not as a burden, but as a child who mattered, it confused him, made him wary at first. He couldn't understand why strangers would offer him food in the middle of the street, or why the elderly man next door kept carving him small toys from driftwood. No one had done anything like that for him in Europe, not even before the war. Their kindness was measured, conditional. Here it came without explanation. The first moment that made him pause, truly stop and feel, came during a storm. A heavy typhoon had battered the village. Banana trees lay broken, and water had begun to pool around the houses. David watched from the window, the rain loud against the tin roof. He was used to chaos, to fear. He had braced for yelling, for panic, for the kind of anger that came with disaster. But instead, there was laughter. His foster father had tied a rope to a tree and was helping the neighborhood children swing into the flooded street like it was a playground. Mothers were sharing food wrapped in banana leaves. Someone had brought out a battered radio, playing old Tagalog songs, and people were singing in the rain. David didn't understand it. Why celebrate in the middle of damage? But the smiles were real. The joy wasn't forced. That was the first time he smiled without realizing it. Later that night, when they sat huddled on mats lit by a single candle, his nanay handed him a piece of cassava cake. She said softly, "Maybe even if we're flooded, there's still blessing." That phrase stayed with him more than the food, more than the music. Blessing even in hardship. It was a language his heart understood better than his mouth. The second moment came at school. David had been enrolled in the local public elementary, where he quickly became the odd-looking kid who didn't speak much. At first he was teased, not cruelly, but with the relentless curiosity of Filipino children. They asked about his nose, his skin, why he ate slowly, and didn't join the games at recess. One afternoon after school, he sat alone under a mango tree. He had tried to answer his classmates that day, but his words had tangled in his throat. Tagalog was still a dance he couldn't follow. He felt the old tightness again, the one that had lived in his chest since the war. But then, a small girl named Lani walked up and handed him a comic book. "Parao," she mumbled shy, "for you." It was a cheap comics issue, one of those brightly drawn superhero tales. Tiny Tony," she added, giggling. He didn't understand at first, but when he flipped through the pages, he saw a tiny man with big courage saving people 5 times his size. A hero, not because he was strong, but because he tried. Lani sat with him, pointing out words, sounding them out with him patiently. "Help!" That was the day David began speaking Tagalog. Not fluently, not perfectly, but with intention. It wasn't just a language, it was a key, and the lock it opened wasn't just his mouth, but his heart. The third moment came without fanfare. He was walking home from the market, carrying a bag of tinapa, when he saw something that stopped him cold. An old beggar sat on the roadside, half asleep. A jeepney driver parked nearby stepped out, not to scold, not to shoo him away, but to hand him a small plastic cup of taho. He even opened the straw and stirred it for the man. No words, no cameras, just a gesture. David stood still, watching. It didn't make sense. The jeepney driver was clearly not rich. His shirt was worn, his hands dark with grease. But he gave without hesitation, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. That was the moment David realized he wasn't just in a new country. He was in a culture where dignity wasn't earned. It was given freely, regardless of your place in life. He remembered something his real mother once told him, whispered through tears the last night they were together. Be kind even when it's hard. That night David didn't sleep right away. He lay on the bannig, listening to the slow hum of crickets and the quiet rustle of banana leaves outside. He thought about his parents, about Germany, about the long, dark years he could barely recall but still felt in his bones. And then he whispered a single word to the ceiling, not even sure why. Salamat, he wasn't sure who he was thanking. God, maybe the family that took him in, the country that let him stay, or maybe all of them. But that was the first time David felt something new take root inside him. Not just gratitude, but belonging. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was beginning to live. Years passed. David grew not just in height and age, but in identity. He finished high school in the Philippines. He learned to say opo with the softness of respect and to stand with a hand over his heart whenever Lupang Hinirang played. By the time he turned years old, he no longer flinched when someone called him Pinoy. But it wasn't until much later, standing in front of a quiet grave under a mango tree, that everything came full circle. His nanay, his Filipino mother in all but name, had fallen ill. Cancer had moved faster than anyone expected. And on her final day, she asked only one thing, that David play the guitar and sing her favorite song, Bayan Ko. He had learned it long ago, just to surprise her one Christmas. But now, as he strummed the first chords with trembling fingers, the weight of the words hit him differently. His voice cracked. He paused, tears running down his face, not from grief alone, but from awe. He realized in that moment he was singing not just to the woman who raised him, but to the nation that had raised them both. After the funeral, David didn't return to Israel. He could have. He still had legal ties. But he chose to stay, chose to make official what his heart had always known. He applied for Philippine citizenship. During his oath ceremony, the officer asked him why. "Why stay, Mr. Weiss?" David smiled, his eyes glistening. "Because this is where I became human again." His story spread, not because he sought attention. David had never liked the spotlight, but because people were moved by it. A Jewish orphan, once displaced and voiceless, choosing to live and eventually die in the arms of a country not his by birth, but by love. He was invited to speak at schools, to tell his story to young Filipinos who had grown up taking their warmth, their generosity, their bayanihan spirit for granted. He would stand there in front of hundreds of students and say, "You don't know what a gift you have. I came from a world where kindness could cost your life. Here, kindness is your way of life." One afternoon after a talk at a high school in Cavite, a student approached him and said, "Sir David, do you ever wish you'd grown up in Israel?" He paused, then bent down slightly and replied, "No, because if I had, I might have grown up safe. But I wouldn't have known how deeply people can love without reason." There was silence. That moment became his mission. Not to rewrite his past, but to illuminate the present, to show the world what the Philippines had given him. Not just shelter, not just food or education, but identity. The final time he visited Germany, it was for a conference on post-war memory. He spoke in Tagalog with a translator beside him and began his speech with a phrase that stunned the room. No country is small when its people have great hearts. He explained how President Quezon, long before others, had opened doors to Jews when the world shut them. He spoke of his nanay, who never once made him feel like a guest. He spoke of a culture that believes food tastes better when shared, that no one should sleep alone, and that even the poorest can be rich in spirit. Then he held up a small object, a simple wooden spoon and fork, set carved by his Filipino tatay decades ago. "This," he said, "was the first gift I received in the Philippines. Not expensive, not grand, but it fed me. Not just my stomach, but my soul." You could hear people weeping in the back rows. And so years later, when David passed away at the age of, he was buried not in Jerusalem, not in Berlin, but in the same cemetery as his nanay and tatay beneath a tree that bloomed with santol. On his gravestone were just 3 words carved in both Hebrew and Tagalog. Pusong Filipino, anak ng Diyos, Filipino heart, child of God. His life had been a journey of survival, but more than that, a journey of return, not to a homeland, but to humanity. And for us, watching, remembering, telling his story, it asks a question we all must answer. What kind of country welcomes the broken and makes them whole again? What kind of people offer home to strangers without condition and call them anak? The answer, of course, is the Philippines. And that is something to be proud of. So the next time someone asks what it means to be Filipino, don't look to wealth or fame or status. Look to stories like David's. Because in a world so often defined by what we close off, the Philippines remains one of the few places still defined by what it opens up. Its heart, its home, its arms. If this story moved you, if it made you proud to be Filipino or reminded you of the quiet power of kindness, share it. Let the world know that in a small corner of Southeast Asia, there's a nation that once opened its doors to a child with no home and gave him not just shelter, but a future. Subscribe for more stories that honor the Filipino spirit, its warmth, its courage, and its unmatched heart. Because somewhere out there, another soul is waiting to know what it truly means to be loved by the Philippines.